Google has traditionally released a new version of Android every year. That's been the pattern for a long time. The only real change happened in 2025, when Android 16 arrived. And it didn't come as a single release. It was split into two. Essentially, the updates were divided into two parts. The first part is what you could call the under-the-hood changes inside the operating system. The kind of changes that are often more important for developers, because they may need to adapt their apps. The second part focuses on changes that matter to users, things that actually bring some visible benefit to the user experience. One release ships in the spring, the other in the fall. It's an interesting scheme. But in reality, Google has been moving in this direction for a while, largely thanks to the architectural changes they've been making under the hood for years. I talked about this in a separate video about Project Mainline. This whole idea of splitting Android into independent components. You can check out that video. It should pop up somewhere on the screen. I explained the whole thing there in detail, and it almost feels like this is the peak of what Google has been working toward. Because if you look at recent Android versions, every year, every time a new beta drops or some change appears, I always look at what exactly has changed. I check the announcements published on the Android developer site, and I also dig deeper, looking at the source code that gets published. And the impression you get is that Android is currently going through one of its biggest transformations. First, let's just look at the facts. It has already been announced that Google will no longer publish development changes as openly as it used to. In practice, Google has split Android into two branches. The main internal development branch, which is now hidden, and the public branch. In other words, most of the development now happens internally, and only later, when something is ready to be shown, it gets published. Second point, Google is changing the Android release cycle. As I mentioned earlier, it's now split into two parts. Third point, Google has completely removed the concept of developer preview. Instead, we now have canary builds. These are essentially regular system builds where experimental changes can appear. Some things land there, some don't. They can be extremely unstable or sometimes surprisingly usable. But overall, they contain various ongoing experiments. And they give you a glimpse of what the team is currently working on. In fact, even some of the features that later appeared in the first Android 17 beta builds could already be spotted earlier in these canary builds. Sometimes indirectly, sometimes through very obvious hints. Of course, not everything gets pushed there. But in general, new features tend to start appearing there gradually. And this has actually changed the way Android is developed as a project. It now has release cycles that are no longer tied so tightly to a single big annual release. Android is starting to evolve more incrementally. Changes are rolled out step by step. In a way, it resembles the idea Microsoft once tried to implement with Windows 10. At the time, they said it would be the last version of Windows, a system that would evolve continuously. The plan was to add updates and new capabilities every quarter. That model didn't quite take off, and eventually Windows 11 appeared. But the idea of an operating system as continuously evolving software still makes sense. And in many ways, Google seems to be moving in that direction. At the same time, Google has separated different layers of updates. System components can be updated independently, apps are updated separately, and many of these updates can even reach older Android versions. And that's actually great, because it allows Google to operate very effectively within its ecosystem. But there's one thing I noticed. For example, when I looked at Android 16, and even what we're currently seeing in Android 17, something stood out. There are surprisingly few major changes that are genuinely interesting for users. For example, one of the early Android 17 beta builds introduced the ability to launch apps in floating windows. There's also a color picker that lets you sample the color of any pixel on the screen. Sounds nice at first, but these aren't really Android features, they're Pixel features. Google officially presents them as part of Android 17, but in practice they're only available on Pixel devices. And the floating window feature is honestly kind of funny. Users of Huawei, Samsung, Xiaomi and many other devices just look at this and laugh. Because they've had similar features for about 5 years already, and often implemented even better. So effectively, Google takes features that manufacturers have had for years, adds them to Pixel and announces them as innovations in Android 17. Okay, but it still feels a little strange. Take the digital color picker they showed. The idea itself is extremely simple. In practice, it's basically just a built-in system tool. Any app can trigger it by making the appropriate call and opening the color selection interface. That's it. So, seriously, a feature that isn't really part of the operating system itself is presented as an Android 17 innovation. And moments like this make you wonder. Maybe it's time to drop numbered Android versions altogether. Maybe it would make more sense to just ship continuous updates. Android as a service. Kind of like what Microsoft originally planned with Windows 10. But marketing still wants big releases. You need major announcements, new version numbers, big updates, and so on. What other kinds of evolution can happen? Well, the classic one is periodic redesigns. Almost every operating system goes through redesign cycles from time to time. Last year, for example, iOS introduced liquid glass. Google also announced its own redesign, Material 3 Expressive. And the presentation looked great. They showed how everything would look, how exciting it would be, but in reality we've only seen small pieces of it in the current Android versions, mostly on Pixel. Pixel Watch got the new design, some Google apps adopted it, and even those are still in the process of transitioning, so technically the redesign exists. But in practice it's not really an operating system redesign, it's more like a new UI kit that Google applied to its own products. It's not actually tied to Android itself and exists somewhat independently. If you're not using Google devices, you might not even care. Samsung has its own design language. Xiaomi has its own HyperOS, ColorOS, OxygenOS, and so on. Every manufacturer has its own system and its own design. Their system apps follow their own visual style. And when you install a Google app, it can sometimes feel like a foreign object inside the system. Overall, it starts to feel like Android is no longer perceived as a single operating system, but more like a base platform. And when Google talks about new Android versions, it increasingly sounds like they're talking about a Google product. Like, here's a new feature coming in Android 17. But in practice, that feature only works on Google devices. And Google is gradually blurring the line between Android as an operating system and Pixel-specific functionality. That's an interesting trend. In the past, Google tried to keep many things inside AOSP. But over time, more and more functionality has become proprietary. AOSP remains the foundation. But from Google's perspective, Android is increasingly becoming synonymous with Pixel. And other manufacturers are essentially using the Android base and building their own systems on top of it. Yes, Google is also developing new platforms. For example, Android XR, the upcoming Android desktop, and the idea of merging Chrome OS and Android. But those are new directions. If we talk about the core Android platform itself, most of the changes right now are happening under the hood. For example, in Android 17, Google reworked one very old mechanism that sits at the heart of the entire UI pipeline. Previously, it worked sequentially and didn't take advantage of modern multi-core processors. Now it has been redesigned to support parallel execution. That's genuinely a good improvement. But there's one catch. We've been waiting for changes like this for a very long time. Many of the parallelism improvements in Android started appearing back in Android 5.0, which was released in 2014. And now, roughly 12 years later, we're still seeing these kinds of changes roll out. Yes, during that time, Android had many other under-the-hood improvements. There were real technical challenges to address because the system evolved very quickly. But today, Android seems mostly focused on paying down old technical debt. Some components are being optimized. Some parts are being refined. In some places, the architecture is being fixed. And it increasingly feels like Google believes the Android foundation is already mature enough. So the main focus now is Pixel. And for Google, that essentially is Android. Everything else is just the Android base that manufacturers use. And many of the AI features appearing now aren't even directly tied to the operating system, because they run in the cloud. Your content is sent to a server. Processing happens there. And the result is returned to your device. And that makes sense. Modern models are simply too heavy to run directly on a smartphone. But that raises a question. What does this actually have to do with the evolution of the operating system itself? In reality, not much. Any app could do exactly the same thing. Send data to the cloud and receive a processed result. Which is why it increasingly feels like new Android versions no longer play such a big role. For example, for a Samsung user, it's usually far more interesting to receive a new One UI version than a new Android version. Developers understand this as well. They have to support a huge range of devices. Many apps still support Android 6, 7, and 8, so most of the time, developers rely on the core platform capabilities that work everywhere. And Android seems to have reached a kind of plateau. There are very few new user-facing features. The ones that appear often work only on Pixel. And most of the real changes happen inside the system. So it increasingly looks like Android 17. And future versions will mainly exist to support new standards and technical improvements. Not major changes to the user experience. What do you think about this? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read all the comments and try to reply when I can. And if you want to learn more about Android development, check out the Android Broadcast Telegram channel. The link will be in the description. See you!